Righty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our author talk in honor of Black History Month. Today's author is Dr. Walter Greason, who is the DeWitt Wallace Professor in the Department of History at Macalester College in the, and is the preeminent historian of Afrofuturism, the Black speculative arts, and digital economies in the world today. Named one of today's Black history makers by the Philadelphia Daily News, Dr. Greason has written more than 100 academic articles and essays. His work has appeared on Huffington Post, National Public Radio, and The Atlantic, among other popular, professional, and scholarly journals. He is also the author, editor, and contributor to 18 books, including Suburban Erasure, The Land Speaks, Cities Imagined, emblematic consequences, and the Black Reparations Project. From 2007 to 2012, Dr. Greason was an advisor to Building One America, the coalition that designed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009. He also served as the founding president of the T. Thomas Fortune Foundation, an organization that saved the National Historic Landmark dedicated to the leading militant journalist of the 19th century. Dr. Greason is currently serving as a special consultant to the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. So welcome, Dr. Greason. We appreciate you so much for coming and speaking with us today. Before we jump into his fantastic presentation, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. First and foremost, we will be taking your questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to submit them at any time using the Q&A or the chat feature in the Zoom dashboard. At the end of the webinar, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. So if you have time, we ask you please fill it out. We always appreciate all the feedback that you give us. And if you want more information kind of on the topic today, as well as, the American experience, African-American experience in New Jersey, the talk is based on his book, The Path to Freedom, Black Families in New Jersey. So if you want to interlibrary loan it, you want to pick up a copy, you're more than welcome to. And I just want to give a little note that the pictures in the book are fantastic, and they really lend a lot of credence to the lived and shared experiences. So they're definitely worth checking out. One last thing I want to go over is just overview of the Zoom dashboard in case you might not be familiar. This is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, the dashboard may look a little bit different, but all of the features will still be there. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can check your audio settings. So if you're using an external listening device, like a headset or earbuds, you can make sure that they're connected properly there. At any point during the presentation, if you have any issues, there is a raise hand button here. You can click on that. That'll alert me, and I will send you a message in Zoom and hopefully be able to resolve any problems that you are having. And as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, you have the Q&A and the chat buttons. You can use either of them to get in touch with us, and we'll be happy to address them at the end of Dr. Greason's presentation. So that is everything that I have for you. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Greason now.
Good afternoon, everyone, even though we've just crossed into the afternoon. It's amazing to be here with you. New Jersey is my home. I spent my entire childhood there, and then had the great good fortune to work with Monmouth University in West Long Branch for almost a decade, an institution that certainly helped raise me. And the work at Thomas Edison State University is a tremendous inspiration to me. So let's see if I can affect my mic a little bit. Let's see. Is that a little better? Can you all hear me more clearly?
It's a little louder, but not.
Let's see. Let's try the microphone
There you
now.
go. That's good.
All right. Good, good. Thanks, everybody. So what I was saying is how much I love New Jersey, that I grew up in Freehold and Manalapan, and that the Jersey Shore is a huge part of my life. I was very fortunate to work back at Monmouth University for about a decade in history and honors education and educational leadership. And so all of that has made it possible for me to have this extraordinary position at Macalester College. It's in St. Paul, Minnesota. It is for many of its supporters and alumni called the Harvard of the Midwest. Amazing place with students from over 100 countries in all 50 states. And so I'm just blessed that you all, educators like you, leaders like you, helped me learn the things and tell the stories of New Jersey that opened up a lot of new conversations in academic history. And so it's amazing for me. I haven't been asked to give a talk specifically on Path to Freedom in at least a decade. And so this is going back to some of my roots and some of the work that grew out of my dissertation research when I was at Temple University. And this particular book um, sets up a couple of major questions that have started to be answered in more detail. So I'm going to share just a little bit of background info so that you all can have takeaways, pieces that you can use in whatever work you're doing. And Path to Freedom is probably the easiest text to adapt out of the works that I've written. So I can't believe at this point I now have written or contributed to 18 books. I swear to God, when I started out as a young scholar, I thought I would publish maybe one or two, and that would be most of it. I love teaching more than anything else. Um, but this book, and I guess I set myself up with the way I put Path to Freedom out. It was the book that earned me tenure when I was just getting started in my career. And it's largely predicated on what was a radical idea at that point in professional history, is that a trade publication centered on African American photography and not of the scale of Gordon Parks, of a photographer who travels from place to place and captures a number of really historically significant photos. But Path to Freedom is about everyday life. What Black scholars, after it was published, began to call the Black quotidian. And that's weird, uncommon word most people don't ever use in life. So I'll just put that in the chat as well. The idea of the Black quotidian connects to a whole body of European history, a lot of art history, in fact, about portraiture, about notions of how we capture ordinary situations that are not about great leaders or amazing moments. It's like the opposite of a highlight reel. What are people doing candidly? And so those of y'all who knew Alan Funk or his work in the 70s of Candid Camera, the idea of documenting quotidian life grows out of that kind of conversation. Unexpected, subtle moments, family moments, personal moments, intimate moments that you can bring forward. And so as I was writing my main manuscript for tenure review, which is what became Suburban Erasure, and it's a much more nuanced and complicated analysis of how New Jersey changes in the second half of the 20th century. I had done almost 50 oral history interviews with subjects across the state. And so that as my basic skill as a graduate student and early assistant professor was bringing new voices to the historical record. And with the most gratifying kind of outcome being that the subjects of those oral histories often entrusted me with their scrapbooks, their photo albums, um, unique kind of objects that they had collected through their lives. And so I needed a way to take some of the elements from my oral history subjects and give them greater life. And this was a profound impact for me in that as a trained historian, we're focused on primary source documents, almost always written documents. Um, and so words are much more important than images. What I discovered by putting together Path to Freedom and doing a series of talks around it is that images have just a very different resonance, particularly when they confront us with the unexpected, with things that kind of violate our received knowledge, the things that we assume to be true. And so, to situate it, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was still this rhetoric around that the Cosby Show of the early 1980s was the first representation of a Black middle class or professional household in American media, which is true. It was drawn in direct contrast against the Jefferson sitcom and Good Times, the sitcom, and back to shows that dealt with the idea of breaking through and showing civil rights struggles in the 60s and 70s, like Julia with Diane Carroll. So there's a very contested experience in media and motion pictures about how African American families are shown. And it was still true at the very end of the 20th century. And that's really where I saw an ability to make a difference in showing the Black quotidian prior to the civil rights movement. And it was a unique history of New Jersey, particularly Monmouth County. It's why suburban erasure has shaped so much new work in the last 15 years. Um, it's this story that, in fact, there were not just sharecroppers and kind of folks struggling to make ends meet, people being harassed and demeaned by law enforcement through the first half of the 20th century under Jim Crow. Those things are all real and true, and it fits a different sector of my work to kind of talk about those experiences. But Path to Freedom was showing that there were African American families building communities, building institutions that actually laid the foundation for what would become the Southern Civil Rights Movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. And there were some really important connections to Martin Luther King's inspiration that came specifically out of New Jersey. And so by starting to tell that story, the story of a Black freedom struggle before the Southern Civil Rights Movement, Path to Freedom was really, really useful. And so I was fortunate that a number of the major professional journals took a look at it. They celebrated the method, they celebrated the technique that came out of featuring how the photos came together, the editorial content. And so this was something important for me. And I guess in the New Jersey sense, it's important to say most of African American history in New Jersey prior to this point focused on large urban centers, especially in the 20th century. Clement Price and Giles Wright are dear mentors and role models, along with Betty Collier Thomas and Larry Green. But there's a focus on Newark, especially, but to a lesser extent on Trenton and Atlantic City and Camden, and smaller independent Black communities hadn't really gotten much coverage in the 20th century. And so in Suburban Erasure, of course, it's a tragic story of how these places are overrun and redeveloped into, massive McMansion kind of suburbs as the Garden State Parkway and the New Jersey Turnpike open up the center of the state to new residential development. But there's a story before that comes after the Underground Railroad stories that Giles Wright specializes in, and before the kind of stories of the contemporary African American experience that so many sociologists, political scientists, anthropologists have done extraordinary work on. So it's filling in this middle area. And I would even say something as profound as the Harlem Renaissance kind of overshadows a lot of the work that appears in the Path to Freedom. And so today I want to basically lay out for you the core structure of the thesis that I present in this book, talk a little about why I chose to didn't do it the way that I did, and then lay out kind of consequences, things that have unfolded as a result of this project. And so at the core is a really basic sense of historiography in the African American community. Most professional historians didn't really read African American history until at the earliest, the 1970s, 1980s. So it's younger. field in terms of having legitimacy for the larger historical community. Um, and that's tragic because there's a lot of this evidence that should have been used in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, but Jim Crow assumptions really prevented that. But within the field of African American history, particularly led by Carter Woodson, who is the founder of Black History Month, or what was Negro History Week, that he chooses February because it is the birth month chosen by Frederick Douglass in the 19th century. February becomes this moment of exploring all the stories that are kept out of widespread public circulation. And so within those histories, Carter Woodson or W.E.B. Du Bois, notably in New Jersey, Marion Thompson Wright, um, there's a trajectory of how migration shapes the movement in New Jersey. And so I begin there. Then I talk about the growth of family structures. How did really large extended families begin to build communities in these smaller towns across the state? At the heart of these community efforts are always churches, always African American churches. They could be Baptist, they could be Methodist, they could be the holiness tradition. But those churches were always at the center of how African American communities survived. This is one of these points that should connect and resonate across history because often churches also served as banks. They provided some kind of social insurance against unemployment. They are the kind of private community philanthropy that allow people that are on the margins or at the bottom of the economic ladder to survive. And so the formation of these churches is miraculous for African American migrants that are coming to New Jersey and really across the nation as they flee the terrorism in the South. And so that story of the growth of Black churches is the fulcrum of the book. And it shows the various ways that church reinforced family and community through the early 20th century. And then I step from there into the pieces that make the transition into what suburban erasure says, is that between 1945 and 1975, you have a huge, just complete revolution in the African American experience in the state because of the 1947 New Jersey State Constitution, where the first article is dedicated to anti-discrimination, to providing equal access and equal rights to all people. New Jersey was the first state in the country to choose to revise its constitution after World War II to prevent the resurgence of Nazism and fascism and the kinds of backlash that prevented immigrants and Black people and Indigenous people from gaining equal rights. And so tremendous change that still bears fruit as New Jersey is a national leader on these questions. And so that shift for African Americans in the state shows up in Path to Freedom in the way that they organized, in the way that they put together civil rights organizations that then went forward and took what were segregated schools and turned them into centers for political organizing, turned them into ways that people created independent household wealth. And so that's what really makes a lot of what Martin Luther King takes away and goes back to Atlanta with and goes down to Alabama with is this notion of nonviolent protest. He actually has a confrontation down in Gloucester County and I want to say Mapleshade, where he's nearly killed as a student when he's in seminary. But he learns that there's a way to confront this, the way to organize to overcome Jim Crow segregation, that then, of course, becomes this internationally famous story where he is able to challenge state and federal government to actually adopt civil rights laws in 1964, 65, and 68. So that piece of New Jersey history is vital. And it's where I really talk about the impact of Black schools. And I try not to do too much with it in Path to Freedom. I leave more of this story in Suburban Erasure. But the transition that comes out of the Brown versus Board of Education case shows simultaneously the power of this civil rights coalition in the African American community and the their ability to win legal cases to open up facilities and opportunities that were denied over the previous 3 or 4 generations. That process, ironically, what I teach as the idea of desegregation, takes a really ironic turn, especially in New Jersey, in that the success of these schools and churches and civil rights organizations falls back on them to essentially dismantle or diminish their social presence and to have Black people as individuals join the really hostile organizations that had excluded them. That the judgment was that despite their effectiveness, their strength in being able to pull together a more inclusive society, Black organizations were seen as inferior. And one of my favorite examples of this, it's actually maybe the most tragic story in New Jersey in this time period, is the Bordentown Manual and Industrial Training School. This was nicknamed Old Ironsides and also called the Tuskegee of the North. And so within a Jim Crow context, this school is training young African Americans to become radio technicians, electrical engineers, aviation scientists. And so it's creating outstanding young professionals that actually become the leaders at a site like Fort Monmouth in Eatontown, where they're leading breakthroughs that grow the strength of the United States. And so this piece, and I'll just ask folks to hold questions till I wrap up. I'm got a couple more things to get through. This piece where people are overcoming enormous adversity and becoming leaders in the wider society, especially in the military, especially, I would say, out of the military, in the emerging science of communication, working with Bell Labs. This is all happening through the 1940s and 1950s. And yet the Brown decision turns into a method at the state level of dismantling the community infrastructure that made all that possible. And so you see these assumptions of Black inferiority take root in New Jersey, and they begin to dismantle whole Black communities and Black institutions that had led to the social changes that made desegregation possible. Is that the idea of integration, particularly under the idea of Black leadership being in charge of how the society would adapt, was rejected wholesale. From 1965 to 1995, there's just massive efforts across the country to prevent the maintenance of the infrastructure that made civil rights possible. And so that's the troubling piece of the success that came out of the Black freedom struggle in the 1940s and 1950s. But within New Jersey, it still did something very important, even within those failures, those barriers that evolved. You had the emergence of larger numbers of African American high school graduates, the really first significant numbers of African Americans enrolling in predominantly white colleges and universities by the end of the 1960s. And so you see this fruitful promise of what, not just desegregation, which is the inclusion of 1 or 2 Black applicants in a predominantly white environment, but the idea of integration, which again, we don't really define very well as a society, but that everyone will have an opportunity to belong if they earn it, regardless of where they come from. And so that's the promise that comes out of the late 1960s and early 1970s. And it really builds the strongest and largest African-American middle class in American history that lasts from about 1965 to 1985. And that's what actually causes the formation of something like The Cosby Show or any number of other African-American sitcoms that show thriving and prosperous Black families. The core of that Black middle class was civil service, people working in county offices, state offices, federal offices. Corporate, private sector employment was much slower. to start to move towards recognizing the skills and resources of Black professionals. But that core middle class, to me, in New Jersey, it's mostly symbolized by folks working, frankly, in corrections. My father was a guard at Jamesburg for young boys. I ended up working at Rahway for a number of years before he retired. My mother worked in county employment down in Asbury Park, and then eventually moved to the Marlborough Psychiatric Hospital. And so there was this social services infrastructure that existed that African Americans with high school diplomas, with college degrees, could move into really very well paying pensioned jobs for the first time between 1965 and 1985. But again, that's where I kind of end the story in Path to Freedom. Suburban Erasure talks about some of the consequences that unfolded from that point forward into the 1990s and early 2000s. And so that is the core of what Path to Freedom does. It shows, for me, most dramatically, the story of Black migrants in the South that are being forced to leave at gunpoint, often being burned out of their homes. And then they're able to find a way north and have to work as day laborers or as domestic servants. And they have very little, but they save and they invest and they become homeowners, which was impossible in much of the South. And so that piece of making that transition from being a migrant to having the means to sustain a family and build a church, these are all tremendously inspirational stories that no one was really talking about in the broader historical discussion prior to 2010 when Path to Freedom came out. And so that was really the struggle, is then making that transition into the harder analysis about the way that suburbs grew and the way it displaced a lot of these really prosperous communities and utterly destroyed places for working class Black people. And so that frame of changing the debate set up a series of conversations that I've been amazed at how they've unfolded. And so I'm going to summarize them in two categories. Um, the first, I am completely caught off guard by the way the conversation has changed. While I was doing all this historical work, and really right before I became a full-time professional historian, I wrote a lot of Black science fiction. And over the first decade of the 20th century, eventually the term Afrofuturism became more prominent. And I can talk a lot about where the term comes from and how it evolved. But that work for me was crystallized working with Marvel Comics on their Black Panther comic book, where I did a lot of work with their writers to flesh out what it was like to imagine a African country that was never conquered, never colonized, never experienced what the rest of the world experienced. And so what would this Black utopia be like? And so I spent about 6 or 7 years writing things online for the comics writers. And a lot of that work has now turned into the things that the filmmakers use. So I've been very proud to see what Ryan Coogler's done with the two Black Panther movies and the variety of things that Marvel Studios has done. And so that Afrofuturist conversation opens the door to tell the story about these Black technicians, these Black engineers, aviators that came out of New Jersey between 1911 and 1953. That there's literally a string of Black communities along the shore from Middletown down to Belmar, where the residents called themselves the Black Brain Belt and talked about how unique it was to be Black scientists in this country, in that region, in that time. That is a real world allegory to what we imagined and could explore as Wakanda in these fictional settings. The other piece that just came full circle for me last week was that over the time of documenting communities that were in danger and being dismantled as the society changed around them, um, about 15 years ago, I visited Eatonville, Florida, which is where Zora Neale Hurston grew up. Zora Neale Hurston is one of the great writers of the 20th century. Her books, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Of Mules and Men, are classics in American literature, mostly for preserving African American dialect and using it as a form of showing logic and intelligence that is not grounded in standard written American English. And so Hurston's hometown last year, January of 2023, was about to be destroyed by expansive development. It's about 10 miles north of Disney World. And we were able to put a stop to the effort to destroy the community. And we've had a really amazing year successfully raising funds and getting national attention to actually preserve Eatonville and to make sure the community is kind of held as a national historic landmark, much like the work we did with T. Thomas Fortune in Red Bank. And so the Southern Poverty Law Center announced last Thursday that they had won the initial legal injunctions to protect Eatonville. And that is actually going to lay the groundwork for thousands of other historically Black communities to seek similar legal protection. And so this is an absolute miracle for me as a kid who grew up in Freehold and Manalapan. And I've seen most of the families and communities that I grew up with destroyed and displaced, erased from the historical record, except for the work that I've done. That work to see Eatonville saved is truly astonishing. And it grows from what we did, what I wrote in The Path to Freedom and exposed in Suburban Erasure. And so that combination of the conceptual framework of Afrofuturism and the real world legal and commercial practice of protecting Black and Indigenous and immigrant communities, this is a really special moment to start and celebrate Black History Month. I do a ton of work with Governor Murphy and several other folks connected to his administration. Very glad to see my colleagues in New York have taken on similar conversations. Out here in Minnesota, we're building a redevelopment campaign in South Minneapolis to restore the community where George Floyd was killed. And then we're also doing work right here in St. Paul. There's a community called Rondo, where with the Department of Transportation, we've exposed the fact that it was targeted for destruction through a highway, I-94, being punched right through the heart of their business district. And so much like the stories of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Black Wall Street, there are actually hundreds of them like Tulsa. And Rondo is another one. It was one of the most affluent Black communities in the country, and it was destroyed by federal policy. And so finding ways that we can intervene and actually restore, the Reconnect Rondo project is letting us build a land bridge over the course of 30 years that will essentially make a tunnel out of the section of the highway. And we can actually rebuild the community and the businesses right on top of where the land bridge is. And so there's real miracles happening around us every day. And for me, it all started with the work to write Path to Freedom. So that was the core and what I wanted to offer and share today. There's so much more to talk about, different examples in different places, but I guess most of all, I want to say thank you to the New Jersey Library, to all of you for attending today to celebrate Black History Month, and to encourage you to go forward and continue to believe that you can do things that are very difficult and even impossible to make for a stronger, safer, better state for all of us. So questions, comments? I know Monica's been waiting.
All right. Yes. If anybody does have questions, please feel free to send them our way, and we'll be happy to talk about them. It was about 10 minutes ago. I don't remember exactly what you were talking about. Somebody coming, you just explained why New Jersey does not have an HBCU.
Yeah, that was literally Frederick Douglass's proposal, was to build that Bordentown Training Institute. It took 20 years for a group of ministers based out of Plainfield to get the funding together to actually open up the school. But it was crazy. After the Brown decision, white students refused to attend. They said, this is, a Black site. We're not going to be a part of that. And then the state refused to give ongoing monies to an institute, despite its success, that had primarily served African American students. And so it actually passes into the hands of the Department of Corrections, and then it becomes a jail site for young boys for a couple decades, which is absolutely horrific. And so I'm trying to press the state legislature to reopen the site as an economic development site, as a place where we can again train people from all backgrounds in the skills and knowledge and expertise that we need in the 21st century to help the state economy grow, to expand new businesses, and basically make the state more prosperous. And so if you can pass the word to anybody you know that is your state rep or your state senator, I talk to Vin Gopal about this a couple times a year, but we definitely need more support to build out the infrastructure that actually makes a stronger state for our families and especially for our young people.
Where would you say that New Jersey currently ranks nationally in terms of its state level support of its African American history?
Ooh. So I don't know that anybody quantifies that officially. I would love to talk to the New Jersey Humanities Council. I think they're the best spot where you could get the closest thing to a clear answer on that. Um, I would say, oh, support it provides to preserve African American
Yeah.
historic sites and archives. Oh, nobody does that. um, so you have to let me parse the answer in two ways. Um, in terms of political kind of rhetoric and people showing up and volunteering, New Jersey is one of the best states in the country. I think of Massachusetts, I think of Virginia, I think of Minnesota. And oddly, it's amazing. Louisiana, mainly because of the French Quarter in New Orleans, does a lot of work to provide resources for state level historic preservation and to tell a variety of stories that can as thoroughly as they possibly can. Um, New Jersey, in terms of monetary support, needs to see historic preservation and specifically the protection of African American historic sites and archives. It's a huge economic development driver, but we don't put a lot of cash into it. And so expanding what we do for the New Jersey Historical Commission, expanding what we do for like municipal and county historic sites, those are really huge priorities that have massive return on investment. And so that's the kind of thing, I still work with the Fortune Center. It's a very, very cheap operation. It takes about $100,000 a year to run. This is not the American Cancer Society that needs, $500 million a year to continue its work. But we struggle because, we're only supported by individual donors for the most part. If we had an infrastructure fund or bank that actually supported our nonprofit and cultural organizations, there are thousands of them statewide and they do extraordinary work, but they would be able to do even more and have a profound impact statewide if it was a legislative priority. And then we really pushed on the governor and the assembly to make it happen. So, I look at that. It's much more city based nationwide. Chicago does a lot monetarily. Like I said, New Orleans, Norfolk, Richmond, Virginia do really good jobs. DC is really good about it. But, even if we just paid attention to Newark, where there's been some really important steps forward to open up what we do in terms of history education and public engagement with history, that would be a solid first step. But the whole state of New Jersey is filled with amazing stories, and we don't do enough to make sure that we preserve them and that we teach them to the people who live here.
Um, what is the New Jersey Humanities Council? Maybe for those who don't know what that organization is.
Ah, let's see. This is basically part of a network of organizations that gets funding, um, state and federal, and they give out a number of grants to do this work. But again, the grants are relatively small and very competitive. And so New Jersey Council for the Humanities are spectacular. I do a ton of work basically advising folks who apply for funding. Um, there needs to be more, like the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, any number of private foundations. I do have to single out the Grunin Foundation that gave a large gift to Monmouth University for a social justice academy that I wrote the grant for. It's done amazing work to support teachers across the state, but they're discontinuing the grant. And so there's no replacement to be able to continue that work. And so it's in a furious rush trying to find the ways to continue to support teachers and school districts that want to do the best work, the most innovative work. Long Branch, as a school district, is spectacular. There's a guy there named Marcus Rodriguez, who he's one of the best educators in the country, but we don't give him enough support to continue to sustain everything he's doing. Um, yeah, there are ways that philanthropy can do things, but legislative action is really unparalleled. And so the Council for Humanities is good. We need to strengthen them, but we also need to strengthen like a dozen other sites of intervention where we can reward people doing amazing work.
What would you say was at the core of the African American resilience during this time period? At post World War II up into the late 70s, early 80s.
So if I'm focusing just on Path to Freedom, it's the decades of work that had gone into building up things like the New Jersey NAACP, the New Jersey Urban League, supported even groups like the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Like there were dozens of Black organizations set to protect whatever African Americans could gain, because like you got to understand the Ku Klux Klan dominated New Jersey from like 1917 to 1929, and even into the early years of the first New Deal. So extraordinarily hostile place. It's why it's so miraculous that you see the state do a complete 180 in 1947 and adopt a constitution that says, yeah, no, we're going to allow all people to come here and build lives, and that makes us a stronger state. Um, Again, this is an enormously important story to tell about what our state is and how we evolved. But I don't know any schools or even really community organizations that teach about what happened in New Jersey between 1917 and 1947. Because that's a story of national significance, but we just don't take the time to put it together and really offer it. I'm working with the governor's office to create an educational timeline of New Jersey history so that this becomes easier for schools and community groups to make reference to. Um, but it shouldn't be me doing this in 2024. Like this should have been done 20, 40, 60 years ago. I should be updating some work, not creating it from scratch. Um, so yeah, this piece about resilience is on the one side in Path to Freedom, it's extraordinary. Even to survive the things that happened after the Civil Rights Acts are passed is actually an even stronger story of resilience. Um, but it's that decimation of the Black middle class between 1985 and 2015, um, the refusal to recognize outstanding Black leadership, not when it comes to somebody like a Barack Obama or some other national or even state level leader, um, to recognize the ordinary excellence of African Americans over time across generations is a real struggle. And not just in New Jersey, but I would say particularly in New Jersey, where there's a chance to actually do that work. Um, it's a huge challenge for the next 50 years. Um, the general assumption that African Americans are not smart enough, not good enough, not prepared enough, underqualified, like that's all a designed rhetorical campaign that has been playing out for 60 years in resistance to civil rights. And the historical record shows it to be completely false. And so that's the problem I'm hoping New Jersey can take a step forward on, is solving and removing the barriers that are in some ways being strengthened to prevent outstanding people who come from African American communities from being treated fairly as they go into the marketplace, as they try to build businesses and maintain institutions that have been eroded and undermined for as long as New Jersey has existed.
Just looking to see if there's any other questions. I don't see anything. Anything you'd like to close with?
My gratitude to all of y'all, and again, my encouragement. I just made a challenge to a local public library 2 nights ago. Um, when you can find and preserve the records of the writers and scholars who have made a difference in New Jersey history, please do so. Please support your local libraries in keeping these records vital. I'm most troubled by Clement Price passed away a few years ago, and I had to fight really hard to get an endowment created for him at Rutgers Newark so that his center would thrive and it wouldn't be shut down and all of his work would be lost. And they've done some amazing things to build on that endowment, but we need more. And so if anyone wants to continue the kind of work I've described here in this meeting, please stay in touch.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Greason. A wealth of info knowledge was shared today, and we really appreciate your time and expertise um, in sharing with our patrons. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. We hope that you got a lot out of this. This program is being recorded, so please look out for an email from me that have a link to the recording. And as I mentioned, if you have time, please complete the survey. We are really excited to hear what you have to say about today's talk. So. Everybody be safe, be well, and please, if you have a chance, celebrate Black History Month. And there's so many ways to get involved and to celebrate. So, and one of the best ways is to tell your story and to keep that oral history tradition going. So,
Oh, I did forget one
yeah,
thing. I know
no,
folks are leaving, so I should have said this before. Um, last November, New York City's school Department of Education asked me to produce an educational resource for their students called The Graphic History of Hip Hop. The basic free edition is out and available right now. And if folks want to get the expanded special edition, that's a hardbound 100-page graphic novel, that will be available in 2 weeks.
great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And everybody have yourself a wonderful day.
Thanks, y'all.